Self-editing is a skill that every writer should have, whether you're going the traditionally published route or the self-publishing route. So if you're going the traditional route, of course, you're going to be querying literary agents and publishing houses, and you want your work to be as strong as it can be before you send it out so that it's received well. If you're self-publishing, of course, the cleaner your manuscript is and the stronger your story is before you send it out to editors, the less you'll actually be spending in editing, which is important, of course, for self-publishing authors, especially those who are just starting out. In today's video, I'm going to talk about when you should self-edit your work, as well as give you some tips for how to go about doing that. So keep watching. Hello and welcome to the Mythic Quill. I'm Leclerc. So first I want to talk about when you should edit, or also when you shouldn't be editing. First of all, do not edit while you're writing your novel. So you want to get through your whole manuscript first before you actually look at the editing. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there's actually a high number of novels that get started that never get finished. So one of the big pieces of advice that people give for finishing your novel is just put your nose to the grindstone and get it done. Don't even think about editing while you're doing it. And another reason for that is when you're writing, you're using the creative and imaginative part of your brain. Whereas when you're editing, you're using the logical, methodical part of your brain. So you're using separate sections of your brain for each process. So make sure you're keeping them separate. Next, make sure you're editing your work before you send it out to beta readers or editors. Again, the cleaner your work is, the less money you'll be spending on the professional editing and so on. When you start editing your own work, it's advisable to start at the highest level. So you're talking about the story level and scene level things. Things like plot and structure and characterization and setting. And you also need to think about what genre are you writing in. What plot structure are you using? Because there's more than one. So for example, I write mostly fantasy and I write usually action epic stuff. So that means, of course, I often use the hero's journey. So I also need to make sure that all the conventions and obligatory scenes for that structure are in my work. When it comes to like tropes and stuff, a lot of people will say, well, you know what, I'm really sick of that trope. It's really cliche now. But the truth of the matter is, if you're leaving out like the things that you should be having in your work, then readers are going to feel like there's something missing, even if they can't put their finger on what it is. And another piece of advice I've heard that makes a lot of sense to me is, in order to actually effectively leave out certain tropes or conventions, you actually have to understand how they work, so that you're kind of adapting your work to fit that. But one of the big things about using conventions and tropes and obligatory scenes, of course, is as a writer, you have to try to innovate ways to use those things in ways that maybe your reader hasn't seen before. So you need to think about those things as well. One suggestion I've heard that made sense to me is that when you're going through your big story level edits, a good idea is to actually write down to keep track of your scenes. Now, of course, if you're a plotter, you'll probably have done this a fair bit at the beginning in the outlining level. But if you're a pantser, you probably won't have. But when you're editing the story level, you might want to write down, like, number your scenes as you're going through, write down a couple of notes about your scenes, what characters are in there. You also might want to keep a timeline, because you want to make sure that everything in your story lines up, so that readers later on are going, wait a minute, but didn't they do this at this week? So how are they doing this now? That kind of thing. So it has to all make sense. So when you're doing that, when you're working at the story level, you can use a Word document, a Google Doc. I use spreadsheets. I find that easier. Or you can even write it on a notepad or in a notebook. That outlining as you're going through will help you look at, do you have all elements in your story that you need? Where are they taking place? Are they taking place in the right areas? And it will also help you analyze the scene level. Because at the scene level, there's a couple of things that need to happen at that level. First of all, scenes always have to have conflict. If your scene doesn't have conflict, it's not going to work. And it doesn't mean, of course, it has to be physical fights in every scene, but there could be things like maybe the character's trying to decide between two options. Maybe they're having a conversation with someone else that they don't necessarily agree with. So conflict can mean a lot of things. Also, the scene has to move the story forward. So if that's just in there because you're talking about a character that you like and you think that character's cool, well, you know what? If it doesn't move the story forward, you need to cut it. Also, scenes have to turn. So that means you're going from like a positive to a negative, or a negative to a double negative, or negative to a positive. And that kind of thing, of course, helps keep the reader's interest. So for example, if you're familiar with the Twilight novels, in the first novel, there's a scene where Bella walks into the science classroom for the first time. And of course, she's sitting at the front of class while the teacher introduces her. And she's uncomfortable doing that. She's shy. She doesn't like being the center of attention. So we're already starting out negative. Then he tells her that she has to sit next to Edward Cullen. And this is, of course, the boy that she was asking about earlier at the cafeteria, the boy that kind of drew her attention, that she was curious about. So you can see that it's going to a positive, because she's going to sit next to this boy she wanted to know about. But when she sits down, of course, he's like kind of grimacing and moving away from her, and she's like smelling her hair to see if she smells bad. So then we're going negative. So that scene is going from like negative to positive, back to negative again. And you can even see that as a double negative because of his strong reaction to her. Now, once you finish looking at the story level and the scene level, then you can go down to the paragraph level and the line level. And this is where you're going to be looking for things like grammar problems, spelling errors, sentence structure, and style even. So you can do a couple of read-throughs. You could do a read-through for just the grammar and the spelling and so on. You can also go make another pass later to look at the style. So one tip I've heard from a couple of different writing coaches is to read your story out loud at that point. That way you'll know, does the sentence make sense? Is it an awkward sentence? And it's especially important for dialogue, because your dialogue needs to feel natural. So if you're reading it aloud and you're like gasping for breath or whatever, then you know it's too long. If it doesn't sound natural when you're reading it out loud, you know you need to work on it and change it a little bit. Now, once you're down to the line level and you're looking at the grammar and the spelling, there are a couple of different resources you should be using. So when we're talking about fiction novels, the main resources we use are the Chicago Manual of Style, and this will answer questions about grammar and style. Couple of things to note, of course, is that there are some style issues that could be solved a couple of different ways. So sometimes you'll find information here that's ambiguous. That means it's up to you as the author to choose which way you're going to handle that situation. So you might also want to keep a note as you're going through of, like, if you came across this problem early in the book, how did you handle it? That way, as you're going through the story, when you're editing, you make sure that every time that issue comes up, you're handling it in the same way. So you need to be consistent throughout your book. Another resource that's important when you're editing fiction is the Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. And this is the main dictionary that's used by most editors for editing fiction. Same thing with the Chicago Manual of Style. That's the resource, the go-to resource for editors for editing fiction. Now, if it's a nonfiction book, the style guide and the dictionary might differ. But because I'm talking about fiction here, we're going to talk about the Chicago Manual of Style, the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. And both of these, you don't actually have to have physical copies of these. Both of these have online subscriptions as well. So you can sign up online, and that means you always have the best, the most up-to-date information. If you've listened to my video and you still find the idea of self-editing to be kind of overwhelming, there are a lot of free resources online. So all you have to do is kind of do a Google search. And you can find a lot of like pre-editing checklists or self-editing checklists. You can find lots of information. But there's also a few resources that I use. And just to kind of clarify again, when I talk about different resources in my videos, these are resources I've used myself. So for a lot of things, I have affiliate links when I post them down below, but I'm not doing ads. The only time I'm talking about books or resources is when I've used those resources myself and I've found them useful. So one book that I have used is this one, Self-Editing for Fiction Writers, by Rennie Brown and Dave King. And it's a very useful book. It doesn't go into the same depth as some other programs or resources used, but it is a good place to start. Now, a couple of different resources I've used that you actually need to pay money to use are Manuscript Magic. Now, this is actually online, so I've made my own binder and printed it my own sheets. But these have, Manuscript Magic works by, first it's giving you some explanations and the steps for editing. And then it has story level edits. So it gives you a list of questions for the story level. And if you have problems at that level, these are all numbered. So you would go to the diagnosing and solving story level problems, and you would look for, if I have a problem with number 16 here, then I would look to number 16, and it would tell me what the problem probably is. And then it will give me a resource to go to. And the resource will have more information. So it's really good that way. And it does the same thing at the scene level. So when you go into the scene level edits, So here we have again the scene level checkup questionnaire. Same thing, it gives you it numbers all the things. You check off whether or not you've done that thing or you have that problem. And again, they're numbered, so when you go to the solution area, you find that number and it tells you what the problem probably is, and it will give you, like it says here, for example, see solution 31, fix for info dumps and heavy-handed exposition. So then you would go to that solution 31 and you'll have a page with a lot more information. So this is really helpful, and it's a good place to start as well. Again, you can find Manuscript Magic online. I'll put the link down below. You can always check it out and see if it's something that you think will work for you, because there's more than one way to handle editing, of course. So you have to find the resources that will work for you. Another resource that I use a lot, and this one goes into a lot of depth, is the Story Grid. Now you can read this book and just use the information in the book to help you. Well, the Story Grid also has like Story Grid University. There's a website with different courses that they do, a lot of different resources and articles. But it is something you have to pay for to do the courses and have access to the resources. Depending on where you're standing in your journey, you might decide to do that or not. You could just buy the book and start with that. If you can afford it, doing the courses are helpful as well. And this one goes really in depth. For the Story Grid, you're keeping track of your scenes like I mentioned before, but you're putting a lot of detail in, like what characters are in the scene, what values, what's the value shift in the scene, and you're keeping track of all that. It's a really useful resource. It's something you have to spend time learning though as well, and practicing. So again, you can check out the link below, and if you want to look at it to see if it's something you think will work for you, then you can do so. But remember, if you can't afford to use paid resources, there's still a lot of free things online that you can access. So while all these resources are great, like the Story Grid and Manuscript Magic, you do have to pay for them. If you're a new self-publishing author starting out and you don't have the funds to spend on a bunch of courses or resources like that, there are a lot of free ones online. So a lot of times all you have to do is Google them, and you can find free checklists, free templates, a lot of things out there that are available to you. Also, there's a lot of videos on YouTube aside from just mine, so look for those as well. So that's all I want to talk about for self-editing for today. My next video is going to be about professional editing. So the different levels of editing, the different types of editing, and what you can expect for each type. And once that video is posted, I will post a link up here. So that's it for today's video. Remember, if you have any comments or questions or anything you want to add, please post them in the comment section below. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like this content and you want to see more content like this, then hit the subscribe button. And if you hit the bell icon, you'll be notified the next time I post a video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.